Greetings everyone. I welcome you all to today's lecture on knowing female agency through an autobiography. In this lecture, we shall be reflecting upon the issue of colonial modernity, education, English language, and how female agency kind of evolved in this background. Historically, Indian women started to write their life stories only from the late 19th century onwards. It is of course a complex and a contradictory fact that women's autobiography writing in colonial India was a byproduct of colonialism and several changes that were going to take place as part of colonial modernity. This genre had its roots in Western literacy and cultural traditions and was born out of a new idea of individualism, selfhood, the desire to know the unknown, get literate, and also to be able to read and write. For this, one can go through a special article that was part of Economic and Political Weekly publication by Himabati Saints. So, in this article, there was an attempt to reflect on a legacy of colonial modernity, social reform, and especially the movement for female education, social reforms, and women's life writing came to be interlinked with the Western idea of individualism. The writing of autobiographies by women denoted the growth of a sense of selfhood, the growth of the feeling of identity that was gradually taking shape. So, a very interesting fact that emerges is as to how memoirs can be taken as history. So, women's personal testimonies are being recognized world over as an important historical source for studying history, especially gender history. So, as one is talking about memoirs as history, a very interesting memoir is that of Himabati Saints, which is an extraordinary memoir because it captures the nuances, the twists and turns of a long journey, of a long life journey of a woman in 19th century rural East Bengal. And it captures different stages of her life, that of her being a child bride and then becoming a child widow at the age of 10 to finally become a lady doctor, in the sense of being a hospital assistant in the Hooghly Lady Dufferin Women's Hospital. So, definitely one can say that this kind of journey explores very complex as well as contradictory relations that emerged in due course of time. One of the most valuable dimensions of this autobiography is the light it throws on women's lives in late 19th and early 20th centuries. It reveals the contradictions that were there within the family, the different forms of gendered oppressions that continued to prevail despite the so-called colonial modernity, and also several negotiations as well as struggles that continued against patriarchal tendencies in society. It also talks about several contradictions and compromises which Himabati had to resort to in order to negotiate during different life situations. So, this autobiography specifically traces the growth of selfhood, female subjectivity, the exercise of female agency and self-assertion, as well as the carving out of an identity in the cultural and historical context of gender oppression that prevailed during the late 19th century colonial India, and it continued to prevail even during the next century. The autobiography, the memoirs of Himabati Saints, is very valuable because it throws light on the lives of women from late 19th and early 20th centuries. And during this period, while one is talking about the rising influence of social reform movements, enlightenment that was going to prevail upon the minds of educated Indians, as well as several reform initiatives that were being undertaken, and also a number of schools that were beginning to enroll women. However, what in reality life was for the females definitely shows a different picture. This memoir of a very unusual woman maps different twists and turns, and how this journey, which began at a very tender age of 8, ultimately ended at a ripe age when ultimately she, Himabati Saints, kind of became independent. She started earning, and in fact she was the sole bread earner for her family. Now, if we briefly discuss the storyline, then we can say that this is the story of a very extraordinary and an unconventional woman. After becoming a child widow in the 1870s, Himabati not only remarried, but she also studied and finally became a lady doctor. And by the 19th century, while the position of women in upper caste society had badly declined and they were subjected to wide-ranging oppressive practices, as emerges from the account of this autobiography, it's also a testimony to the oppressions that women were subjected to, their struggles, and finally their resistance against that oppression, because only this can explain as to how and why Himabati Saints finally became a doctor from a child bride and a child widow. So it also kind of throws light on the gendered struggle for education. So while Himabati wrote her memoir in the 1920s, it largely remained unpublished during her lifetime. Himabati's notebook too, which was written in Bengali, lay for 2 generations with her family and came to be finally translated and published only during her grandchildren's time, almost 80 years after her death. Indrani Sain has examined this memoir by situating this memoir within the gendered struggle for identity, education, financial independence, which also characterized women's struggles during 19th and 20th century colonial India. So as one goes through the account of this autobiography, what emerges is that how patriarchy was kind of prevailing right from childhood, and then definitely after family life started, and the very institution of child marriage was also part and parcel of the system. So Himabati Ghosh was born the eldest, and she was the favorite child of her father, who was a very rich zamindar belonging to the Kuleen Kayastha caste in Khulna in East Bengal. Although he was not interested in reform, he was highly intelligent, and he kind of also recognized the intelligence of the firstborn child, Himabati. So he kind of allowed her to learn reading, and also allowed her to wear boys' clothes and pick up some kind of education from her cousins. In contrast, the women folk in her family were far more traditional, and they did not like the idea of Himabati learning reading or writing. It was at the initiative of her mother and grandmother, and against her father's wishes, that finally Himabati was married off at the age of 9.5. Now, since that was the practice, so that had to happen to Himabati also, irrespective of the fact that whether she was good at learning, she was intelligent, or she was one of the favorite child of her father. So, marriage in the Kulin subgroup of the three upper castes in Bengal, that is Brahmans, Vaidyas and Kayasthas, had to be conducted within the same Kulin subgroup. So that was a very important precondition. So even if it was an unusual marriage as far as the age of the groom was concerned, because her Kulin Kayasth husband was almost 45 years of age. He was twice widowed with two daughters nearly of her age. And it was quite common during those times to find a huge gap between the widower grooms getting remarried to child brides, and that was to be the case in the case of Himabati also. So now started her phase as the child bride. Although the groom was a deputy magistrate in the colonial bureaucracy, so he was holding a government job, it did not stop the marriage from being conducted in violation of the minimum age of 10, which had been fixed in 1860 as the legal age of consummation of marriage for girls. This shows that the rules and regulations were there, but then it was a different matter altogether whether they were being followed and implemented with same zest and zeal or not. The middle-aged husband was addicted to prostitutes coming to his room at night, and he tried to consummate his marriage with a child who had his daughters as her playmates, as has been described by this as it emerges in this memoir. So, Himabati wrote that looking back almost 50 years on this experience, this gentleman, a deputy magistrate, was a person of this sort. For shame, this man is my husband. I cannot put in words the sense of revulsion I felt. So this clearly shows that how Himabati regretted her marriage right from the beginning, and how much she hated her husband, and it was really a frank confession. She frankly delineated that how her husband made repeated attempts at sexual intercourse, and she would silently sit, and she was stiff like a piece of wood. So she was just not interested in anything that was happening to her. So as we reflect on child widowhood and how Himabati was negotiating oppression and resistance, so what emerges is that within a few months of her marriage, the husband suddenly fell ill and he died of pneumonia and liver abscess, and left Himabati as a child widow at the age of 10. Now, initially, her mother-in-law called her an ogress who had eaten up her son, just like all the allegations that were made towards the child widows. And she also enforced her to observe austerities like fasting or eating frugally, and also telling her not to oil her hair. So all these kind of restrictions were imposed on this young girl of 10 simply because she had become a child widow. And as Himabati was recalling her feelings of helplessness, so she wrote that I just lay in a corner. My parents had finished their duty towards me. No one was responsible any longer for this child widow. If I needed a single paisa, I would have to beg it from others. So this clearly describes that how much Himabati suffered during those days. However, she also wrote that in due course of time, her mother-in-law allowed her to resume a normal life. She started wearing bangles, eating fish and retaining her long hair, and did not subject her to disfigurements. For example, hair shaving or dietary restrictions that were generally imposed on widows. And Himabati also started helping out in domestic work and also studied in her free time. So, here one comes across a very important observation, and that was questioning literacy. So, Himabati recollected in her autobiography that how her own relatives abused her for devouring her husband, and they started kind of laying allegations on her that only because she had learnt to read and write, she was a literate person, that they had lost their son-in-law. So Himabati regretted that here there were her relatives who had all the sympathy for that 45-year-old corrupt person, but they had no sympathy for her, who was their daughter. So her own mother and grandmother blamed her literacy for her widowhood, which was a common practice and a common thought process during those times. She recalled how one relative even commented, everybody knew that she would be widowed if she learned to read and write, but still she did that, so that was going to be her fate. Now, another very sad reflection that emerged was that how her situation in her marital home started deteriorating when her mother-in-law also passed away. And now Himabati suffered the typical widow's fate of financial and physical deprivation as well as dispossession of property. It was now that, due to being subjected to the daily dose of humiliation, that Himabati decided to move to Banaras, which was the traditional place of refuge for Bengali widows. So now we come to the next chapter, and that is Banaras, the city of widows. So what happened at Banaras? At Banaras, she decided to live in semi-starvation rather than accept help, and she started surviving on only 3 handfuls of rice with salt, and even going without food for 6 or 7 days. And this kind of austerity greatly impressed the people around her, who started praising her that here was a virtuous and an ascetic widow who had all the qualities of being a sadhvi. However, the issue that was very important and which Himabati was intelligent enough to understand was the issue of inheritance, which used to force the widows of Banaras to take refuge in Banaras, and most of them, they used to come from Bengal. The Daya Bhaga school of law, which was prevalent in Bengal, allowed a widow to inherit her husband's property. So therefore, to avoid this situation and to not allow the widow inherit her husband's property, the widows were very conveniently siphoned off to Banaras in name of spirituality and leading a pure life as a widow. So relatives were eager to misappropriate a widow's property. They would subject them to such neglect and ill treatment at home that they would on their own migrate to Banaras, and this is what happened in case of Himabati also. So widows were cheated of their inheritance by their male relatives, and they were reduced to poverty, and they ended up taking refuge in Banaras. Now, what was life like in Banaras? Widows had access to food in Banaras either through singing bhajans, begging, or fulfilling lust of pilgrims and men. Himabati soon discovered that there was no escape from lustful males even in the holy city of Benares, and this resulted in unwanted pregnancies, prostitution and suicides that were attempted by widows. So therefore, now Himabati had to traverse through these challenges very bravely, and she indeed did that. So Himabati has written that how she was encountering the lecherous behavior not only in Benares along the Ghats, but also by police constable in rural East Bengal, and also a seduction attempt by a Raja whose wife she had been employed to teach. So then she also talks about the reality of widow homes. Widow homes were largely an outcome of 19th century gender reform movements. The ground realities, however, of such reformist widow homes were quite different. Himabati also realized another great truth about being a widow in a patriarchal society, and that was that sexual morality of a widow was always suspect, while the men were the real troublemakers and no one raised finger on them. So Himabati soon discovered that even the homes for widows, which had been set up to provide them refuge and protection from abuse, however, were not safe, and in fact they themselves were, the men who were conducting business over there themselves were sexual predators. During her boat journey to East Bengal, she came across one victim who was a very young pregnant widow named Tara, who bitterly cried and revealed that how she had been promised marriage by the son of the head of the widow's home where she had been living, but had been thrown out by his parents, and this was a very sad situation for her. So having discussed all these various aspects that one can talk about with reference to the life of a widow or the life of a child bride, one can very well imagine as to how challenging patriarchal institutions were and how realistically Himabati has captured each and every detail. Thank you.